So one of the questions was that given the fundamental nature of contracts is interpretive flexibility due to limitations and imprecision of language, how can this be replicated in code? Would we need some sort of fuzzy logic or legal AI? Alastair, do you have a thought on that?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess I see these systems when it comes to arbitration, for example, very definitely having humans involved for the foreseeable future. So I don't know that we would go down sort of fuzzy logic route per se and put the onus back on the system, so to speak, for solving or mitigating these ambiguities. I think that the current legal system and the current methods for dealing with those types of issues kind of kicks back in. And so that switch between either a multi-chain existence where certain things are done on one chain and certain things are done on other, or on-chain and off-chain systems, I think is likely how this stuff develops early on.
I think legal AI is certainly developing at pace, and it's in terms of in the legal news, you often see is the latest big thing, but as you said, it's not going to be the panacea for it. Is it the fact that certain parts of a contract will be more suitable for smart contracts, and some parts will just you are just not at the moment appropriate to use smart contracts for, the ones which require more human logic or more subjective views? Alistair, Richard, anyone?
Yeah, so certainly I think where I think machine learning uh, is most pertinent at the moment isn't really in the contract logic per se, but is in the measurement process. So if you want to measure a state of the world and record it in a contract, it's likely, go back to Richard's point about digital twins, and having a digital twin of a physical object, it's likely that measurement process of the physical asset, for example, that is in the contract is likely to involve an automated process of measurement. And that itself is likely to have some machine learning in it. But I think probably the focus at the moment with the kind of the AI systems will be on the instrumentation of the contract, not the logic of the contract per se that the counterparties wish to enter into.
Richard,
Yes,
where do you see this going, considering where we are now and the development of AI and all the other technologies that go with it?
well, I think there's a tension, between ways of reducing uncertainty through technology, which should make disputes less of a problem, and the perverse commercial setup which lies behind our contracting model at the moment. An example of the first thing is, I'm just trying to remember what it's called, but there is a technology which is now being quite enthusiastically picked up, where a camera can go around, perhaps stuck on top of a supervisor's helmet every day, checking on a building site as to where the work has been done. And the checking is done by artificial intelligence, looking at the state of the work, comparing it to where it ought to be on the model. And if the model and the camera agree, then it's quite clear that the work has been done satisfactorily, and the payment may well be generatable on that basis. If they don't agree, then you've either fallen behind or you've done something incorrect, and that's an issue. And then there's an issue. Then there's a process to address the issue. So that there's quite a lot of AI involved in that sort of technology, but it obviously is capable of greatly reducing arguments about what the state of things is. But the perverse side of it is that in the present contracting model, the main contractor is basically trying to avoid paying. He makes his money out of withholding payment because he doesn't have any capital at risk, hardly any. So he uses the money that the client gives him as his working capital and meters it out as slowly as he possibly can to suppliers and subcontractors by taking issue, sometimes quite spuriously, with what's been done and what's not been done. And it's pernicious. And that's why I think we have to look beyond the way things are done now to see technological solutions. But gradually, I think the pincers will close and contractors will be faced with a situation where they have to pay on the in an automated manner, and that their only way out is to give themselves much more capital to play with, or get the client to pay them a great deal more up front so that they don't have to starve their suppliers and behave irrationally to do so. So rationality may well advance as artificial intelligence removes the uncertainties one after another.
Are there then any areas of technology that could helpfully be developed to support the use of smart contracts apart from AI?
I'm thinking more beyond the present business model rather than trying to make the present business model smart contractable, mainly because there's so much human judgment involved in the way we do things in the industry, and there's so much room for doubt. So unless we can move the human judgment element aside by making most performances monitored against the model that is supposed to exist, which can either be done in this as a service style of delivery or by advanced offsite manufacturing approaches where human judgment is less involved. It's more of a quality system which monitors itself. We could see smart contracts being applied in the vending machine model rather more specifically in that way. But if it's about human labor on sites doing things approximately right, and main contractors incentivized not to pay, I don't think we'll see much scope.
And Alastair, in terms of case law and regulations, you mentioned about kite mark. Are you aware of any current case law and regulations that apply to smart contracts, and how would what you're doing with the core project impact that?
Yeah, I think the answer is it's coming. So I can't reel off exactly the state of play off the top of my head, although I would have colleagues that could. But there's the UK Jurisdiction Task Force, which is led by Sir Geoffrey Voss, which is looking at setting test cases in the UK for smart contracts as we speak. I don't believe one has gone through, although someone might jump in and tell me that that has changed. So certainly the UK is looking quite actively at regulatory guidance when it comes to these systems, but I don't think and there is enough precedent set yet.
And there's a question here that says, with regard to oracles, how can you make an external resource reliable? Do either of you have views on that?
Well, so I mean, you're essentially depending on what you're trying to record as the state, you can have multiple sources of information, and you can come up with some logic for when to trust it and when not to trust it. The point being, to a certain extent, that it doesn't have to be the exact state of the world. That may still be called into question, but the fact is that you can then point to the oracle as an agreed state of the world rather than the actual state of the world, right? Which is that if these sets of sources are amalgamated in this way, which is documented, which is a protocol, are as they say they are, then the obligations in the contract stand, and the counterparties to that contract can act into that in the same way that they could already. If you think about the banking rate being published on the the Law Society website, for example, that is entered into contracts. It's not machine readable, and you don't necessarily have the history of when those base rates are updated, but they are there. And then I think there are practical examples at the moment. So you've got a talk tomorrow by EHAB. If you think about parameterized insurance and weather contracts and agricultural contracts, these systems are already being used actively in the market. It's just a question of them diffusing elsewhere. And I could just go back to your earlier point about technology. I think this, I mentioned that sort of AI stroke machine learning might be used in the measurement process. Probably the other large area of technology is around direct sensors themselves, so kind of IoT. You know, the fact that your steel beam might know where it is and how long it's been there and what other things it's interacted with, and the ability to audit with smart, you know, sensors across the supply chain is probably the other large source of innovation coming on stream, you know, low power, etc.
In some ways, it's all the different sources of data and information that could be then fed into into it. And but that, I suppose, applies to all technology, where you're getting your data and how much does it know. One thing that someone's asked is how to protect IP on a shared distributed ledger. And certainly from my point of view, I think this is illustrative of, you can't just put aside your written contract or the general contract that sets out your copyright and who owns what. And the ledger has to work in with that. And generally your contract would say, you own this bit, I own that bit, you have a license, and it would just work together with it. Do you agree?
Yes, I think we're going to need a protocol for this, aren't we? In the way that we have a protocol for BIM instructions, we're going to have something that enables us to use contracts of this sort on a structured basis, so we know what we've agreed to before it happens.
I also think that the notion which everything is on chain and transparent and audible isn't quite true either, right? You can have a whole load of address. You can do a GDPR compliant chain by storing the address. You could oracleize a source of data, whether it's IP or not, somewhere that can be called upon given if certain conditions are met. And the chain that you're using for facilitating the transaction doesn't have to have the information on it per se. So this notion in which we have multi-chain systems, just as we do, you know, we have multi-chain systems in the structure of governance as it is. They just happen to be, you know, pen and paper with a set of governance mechanisms. So the complex, I don't think anyone is suggesting that we should reduce the complexity of governance mechanisms that have demonstrably worked. Right. The idea is to capture the best properties of those existing governance mechanisms and, you know, introduce some technology to help support them better. The notion in which suddenly everything is on chain and a free for all, I think, is unlikely.
I think sometimes it's easy to forget that all of these things are processes and tools. They're not suddenly going to be this one button solution to all your problems and make everything different. There's a question about delay claims and whether they can be monitored using blockchain. And if each delay event can be recorded on a ledger, will that be a record? And I think, again, this goes back to the point we're talking about, where using a blockchain or using a smart contract is a tool and a record rather than a completely new thing in itself. And it should be complementary to what you're doing already in terms of recording. But can delay claims be monitored using blockchain? I don't see why not. In a sense, it's just a data record.
Yeah, I think one of the, I'm not certain whether it made it to the slides, but obviously one of the things we have modeled and got smart clauses for is delay or withheld payment to do with rent. And if you look at the Accord working group on supply chain or one of the Oracle working groups on supply chain, putting in payment mechanisms and modeling delays is one of the things you could use the system for, or these types of system for. I don't know if that answers the question.
What do you both see as the big problems then about using smart contracts? What's going to hold the construction industry back? I think mindset is a big one, as we saw with BIM and other technologies, getting people to buy into something not being just the latest buzzword. And I hear a lot when it comes to blockchain and smart contracts, people kind of just wave their hands about and say it's just going to go away in 6 months. But is there any other practical things and practical risks that people need to overcome to implement smart contracts in a big way? Richard, would you like to start?
You're shaking your head.
Yes, I think the traditional industry is a hard case and is not really interested because it has a hard time getting through the week. You know, its margins are so tight, its interest in innovation is minimal. Once you start moving into industrialized construction with supply chains that are stable and long term, you have an opportunity for supply to be automated or semi-automated. If you imagine components flowing towards a factory to make a module of a building, an element, the arrival of those elements at the factory is something that can be relatively automatically scanned. The correct assembly can be relatively automatically understood, so it will be automated. So you look at those supply chains as being much more like a conventional industrial supply chain. The way the jet engine would put together would be very similar, with the pieces arriving quality controlled and then put into place under a much more rigorous regime than we use in construction today, and capable of much more automatically being approved and paid for. And I think that will make a big difference. I don't think digging holes in mud is going to be an issue that is going to help. And we're not going to get conventional construction smarter. It's going to be the unconventional that is supported by this and made more competitive by it.
Alastair, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think I concur with Richard's point that construction as a sector has its own challenges. You know, you haven't seen wide-scale adoption of these technologies outside of finance, really, full stop at the moment. I would say, you know, some of the use cases that are probably more advanced from a Mishcon perspective are actually our own internal ones, in terms of sort of legal data supply chains and working with, you know, selected commercial partners. So I feel like where there is an easier route to adoption, if we think about Richard's point on industrial supply chains, where you have a large prime, you know, whether that's the government or not, but a large prime contractor, obviously they can start to dictate, you know, terms to the supply chain in a way that can't happen if you start in the middle. And so, you know, I think there are probably easier aspects, easier ways into the market for different actors. I don't think you see wide scale adoption across the board in a kind of you know, phase change moment. These things will start in various places earlier than others.
So where is it going to be, smart contracts going to be most useful then? Because we often hear about smart contracts being used for payment retentions, but is that the most optimum area in terms of construction for smart contracts to be developed, or is it, or are there different aspects of the way we do construction that could be improved, shall we say, by smart contracts? And in my talk, I mentioned about the provenance of materials and goods being, and you can use smart contracts for that.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of a product having a really good passport attached to it that says that it contains exactly what it's supposed to contain, and that all of its carbon footprint has been properly tracked, and the item is therefore beyond suspicion and exactly what you ordered. That would be good, and one could imagine that that kind of use of an attached packet of data to a physical product would be excellent, and if that can be done through a blockchain device, whether it's called a smart contract or not, that would be very helpful.
Alastair, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we should just think of this as flows of information and flows of verifiable information verified in a way that the sort of chain allows, which is slightly different to something off chain. And the end transaction, the end transaction of that flow of information may be a payment. You could link it automatically to Stripe or something based on a clause, but equally, the things that we're looking at are can you follow a flow of information so that you know that a particular machine learning engine has been trained on data from this company and this company combined in this particular way. So can you audit the kind of machine learning supply chain, which is important as engines and machine learning in general start to diffuse. That's equally important to us in some sense than checking that a payment has been made, right? So if you can think of a set of processes where measurement and the recording of measurement so that they can be checked against obligations is important. Most people think of the payment as the end part of the process, and certainly the atomic transaction I showed you on the land registry, that is the last part of the payment is of exchange, is payment and transfer of ownership. But along that stage, every piece of information that flows in might be thought of as the terminating event of another chain. And so figuring out which terminating events or what things should be thought of as events as opposed to processes, to go back to your point about process management, that depends on the business model, and that depends on the thing that's most important at the time, right? If payments are the critical piece for changing the functioning of the system, then payments is a good thing to track as an event. If it turns out that it is the arrival of goods, or is more critical than the structure of payments for the arrival of goods, then the arrival of goods is the thing to monitor and measure and diffuse on chain, for example.
There's been a number of questions about the relationship of BIM with blockchain and with smart contracts. And I'd say, as regards that, obviously BIM is ultimately about electronic data. And we see that with the golden thread now, with the need to have a recording of data which is true. And probably blockchain and smart contracts will come into its own as regards working with BIM in that regard. Mm-hmm. But again, does it need to be formally incorporated in terms of how people are doing BIM? You don't necessarily hear the word blockchain or smart contracts at all in that conversation. And is that something we need to start encouraging, a combination of, if you're doing BIM, here's a tool that could very helpfully make your process more efficient, and when you're uploading models, where the models came from. No one's played around with it.
Yes, I think there's an interesting argument, at least to me, about what's wrong with the common data environment. Why isn't the common data environment of today sufficient as proof of events having happened, and as a single source of truth? And I'm sometimes told, "Oh, you don't understand. It's not the same at all." But a blockchain backing up a CDE, so that you have archived versions as it keeps evolving, that sounds reasonably logical to me. Every time you archive the CDE because it's changed, you will want to track back and audit. And the question is, are you happy that nobody can mess with that CDE? Nobody can change the record. So maybe the blockchain is a very good way of backing up the CDE as it goes into archive.
And Alastair, there's a question here about subtypes of smart contracts. Are there subtypes or small components of smart contracts for engineering, procurement, construction, since each phase has a unique style to draft a contract? Does it differ?
They do. I think so. For example, RICS is starting a standards thing, and I'm presume that JCT will also have a standard in due course. Whether or not those align with British Standard Institutes of Smart Contracts remains to be seen. But I think if I just defer slightly to the last question quickly to Abel, Abel Moss want to say something about BIM and blockchain.
Yes, I think, yes, there is a very interesting overlap there, you know, embedding blockchain into BIM processes. I think there are a few problems. So the common data environment at the moment it gives you a lot of functionalities and a very welcome consolidation of information for the building information model for pre-construction and construction. But there is also the problem how geometry is generated in BIM and how it is articulated in common data environment. I think this will have to change because, for example, we still see nowadays an architect is modeling a building, and we create the architect structural model of the building. So when the engineer comes along, they will model the engineer's structural model and overlay this on the architecture structural model. And so we don't know which one should be. So there is a period of time of that which model should be using for what is very ambiguous, and this is to do with how we articulate geometry in the common data environment. And I think blockchain can be used to address this. And smart contracts can be embedded in BIM processes to address this as well. Not so much to as a legal contract, but as a coordination automation process.
Is that then a matter of people, parties agreeing that at the outset, this is what we want to use the blockchain for in terms of improving the way we do BIM?
Yes and no. I think yes, it should be agreed that will be there, but I think it also could be in the background. This smart contract could be in the background doing just basically saying, okay, Mr. Architect, you have your structural model here, and this is being copy monitored by the engineer's structural model, for example. But it's time for you to do not use this anymore, etc. Or you can use this just for certain features. It could be a kind of shadowing process and a warning process. The other thing is how the geometry is put together itself. So it's I think in BIM now, especially on the most popular packages, we use manifold geometry, and it could be non-manifold geometry. There are better ways to keep track on what is going on in the geometry, and so we know that the metadata we're reading from that geometry is the relevant metadata to be used in the project. And I think blockchain can help with this ambiguity in processes as well.
So we have time for one more question. There's a question here about using a CD against a blockchain and how, from a technical point of view, the difficulty of deleting or changing data within a CD. I personally don't see that problem because you could use the blockchain as a record of the CD at a particular time, or you can just add, as long as it's clear you're adding to the blockchain in terms of when the information got updated. It's not a matter of you having to replace a model. And that's, I think, a new way of thinking rather than deleting the file that you have on your CD now and uploading a new one. You're just adding to. So it's actually better because you can see where the changes occurred. Richard, what are your views?
Oh, I think the CDE doesn't have deletions on it. It simply has versions, you know, and as the thing evolves, all of its previous states are still there. So you don't delete. You do all that in your work in progress before you add stuff to the CDE. Once it's in the CDE, it's a version, it's an official state, and that will be accessible at any time in the future if you need to get back to it. But it will go on being overlaid by further and further changes. And it ought to be entirely single source without doubt, as whether the employer owns it or the contractor or the consultant. And there shouldn't be any point of difference or ability to go and fudge the record. And it's this fudging of the record which blockchain is often sold as a solution.
I think we're out of time. Abel, Leo?
Yeah, that's great. That's been a really
Yes.
nice, thorough discussion. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess we'll move on to the break now. According to my single source of truth here, we've got 15 minutes for a break, and then we'll be back for session 3, legal tech frameworks for automation. So yeah, time for a coffee, I think. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Very
you.
good, thank
you.
Cheers.